VenomousStare back with another classic StarCraft 2 game. This time we have a TVZ between my personal favorite player ever, Greg IdrA Fields, in the bottom right, and he's facing off against Startail Bomber. And this was in late 2011. This occurred at one of the best and most famous LANs in StarCraft 2 history, that being MLG Orlando 2011. This was a LAN that occurred at the end of 2011. And if you look at the history of StarCraft 2, and you look at the year 2011 specifically, a few things jump out at you. First of all, the phrase peak of the game, or the best time to be in the scene. A lot of people, oftentimes when they think of 2011 or 2012, like those are the sort of vibes that they get right away, is like, man, I miss those times. Back in this time, we had a LAN every weekend, like a big, holy shit, premier S-class LAN with all the best players. We're talking, you would have an MLG Orlando one weekend, a DreamHack Stockholm the next weekend, and NASL Finals the weekend after that, and then IPL Finals the weekend after. It was just absolutely insane to be a StarCraft 2 fan at this time. And in 2011, the meta had stabilized and the maps had gotten better, because remember, the game came out in 2010, the summer of 2010, and the beta was in March of 2010. So the players had had about a full year since the game had officially come out to develop strategies and figure out the meta. And for the first probably like 6 months of the game, there was a lot of rushing. There was a lot of players just trying to figure out the basics of the game as far as what you could do and what you could get away with. And the maps were very small, which is something that promoted this sort of behavior. And we can see here Bomber is rallying Marines across the map. It looks like he's going to go for a bit of a 1-Rax expand here. But this was something that you could do to Zerg, and he's going to try to deny the drone here, which is a huge deal, because if you kill that, IdrA runs all the way in and really sees, okay, well, there could either be 3 more racks behind this, there could be 1 more racks behind this, he could be starting to mine gas and teching up into factory, which is what is actually happening, or he could have a CC. From the beta all the way until, say, early 2012, it was incredibly common for Terran players to feign bunker pressure or straight up put bunker pressure on that was real and committed. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that the maps were way smaller, yes, but there was no neutral depot at the bottoms of ramps on ladder maps and not in tournament maps for years, and the bunkers salvaged for 100% for a long time. So Terrans could really get away with pressuring Zerg tremendously, but then really not having that much repercussion if it failed. And whenever I think about the current day StarCraft 2 meta all the way into 2023 Legacy of the Void, man oh man, it is so hard for Terran to pressure. And the beginning of the game, we never see anything interesting like this, unless the game is just a straight up 2 racks where the Terran's completely committed to a bunker rush, which is a build that was around in 1999 in StarCraft 1 and will be good until the end of time, because Zerg always wants to expand, and if Terran can get a bunker rush off before they can get their pool off, then that's always going to be something that is kicked around the Terran vs Zerg. Even if there was like a StarCraft 3, there'll probably be a bunker rush in that game too. It just goes down to the very core mechanics of Terran vs Zerg, where Zerg is trying to mass expand and get a bunch of drones up, and Terran is always trying to pressure the Zerg and not let the Zerg run wild, as you see IdrA put his first tumor down. And Blue Flame Hellion is going to be researched. Now, Blue Flame Hellion was incredibly popular at this time because the Blue Flame upgrade did +5 more damage to light units than it does now. And whenever we think about the current meta in Legacy of the Void, it's way harder for Terran to do anything in the ramp up. We're talking from minute 0, from right when the game starts, to 7 minutes in. The ability for Terran to pressure and mess with Zerg is so much different in Wings of Liberty than it is in the current meta. Think about how long the windup is. Here we see 7 minutes on the game timer, and let's not get bogged down in them changing the clock at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm. If you're a viewer, you look at the clock and you see it's 7 minutes in the game. Does it matter that it's like 5 IRL minutes? No, it motherfucking does not. The crux of the issue here is we're 7 minutes into this game, and Terran is still making decisions and massing up and figuring out what he's going to do to pressure Zerg. Zerg is building up way slower. Zerg has less scouting options. Remember, this is late 2011. This is before the Queen and Overlord buff that really made Zerg way more sturdy. And Terran was able to do aggressive builds like this, as we see Bomber really putting the pressure on and canceling tumors, and you just have to be so worried about a bunch of Hellions running up into your main here if you're IdrA. But he has the Evo chamber, he's got the spire started, the Baneling Nest is on the way, another spine coming down, and that spine placed very intelligently sort of in the middle of his natural is worth its weight in gold. Having that one spine there really helps you not die to Hellions. Because if we look at StarCraft 2 in the current meta, which is going to be a big focus of this video, because I know a lot of people are sort of tired of watching StarCraft 2 in its current state, and even though Blizzard just did a big patch, even though the patches are very infrequent, the vibe is sort of like, this ain't it, Chief. Like, some of the changes are good, like the Ultralisk buff, making the Ultra smaller, so you can actually go Ultras as Zerg, is a good thing. The shield battery nerf is a good thing, because the shield battery was a stupid, disgusting gimmick. But I think what we really want to see is for the players to be able to be aggressive, and for the game not to be so terribly cookie cutter and boring, especially as far as the verse Zerg matchups go. We can see in this game, even though the Zerg player IdrA defended brilliantly, a borderline flawless defense from the Feign bunker rush all the way up into the Hellions, running the drone up to try to scout that build. All of it was beautifully done, but don't be fooled, it was a tenuous hold. If IdrA had skipped the spine, if he hadn't gotten the drone in, if he had missed the move out, these are all little things that could affect how he defended the push. And what happens if IdrA doesn't do all of those things, if he doesn't get the drone up and see that, okay, he took a gas, he's going Hellion? And, well, what ends up happening is the macro machine gets rolled over and dies, because Zerg is way more flimsy. Think about when that push occurred, as Mute has come out here. What did the Terran player, Bomber, the incredibly talented top-tier Korean at the peak of his powers, what did he have out on the map? 6 Blue Flame Hellions, and that could have bowled IdrA over. Why? Because IdrA couldn't make a bunch of extra queens. Why? Because queens only had 3 anti-ground defense range in this era, and they also had less anti-air range. They were way worse overall. If you look at any TVZ now, the Zerg is always making queens out of their natural. Because of the queen buff that happened in 2012, mid-2012, probably like 7 months, 8 months after this game was played, at MLG Orlando, which was really one of the first big Western lands to have all the top-tier Koreans come over. And part of why that's so interesting is Chris Loranger, aka Little Huck, would actually win this tournament. This was Huck at the peak of his powers. Huck is a guy with Florida roots as well as Canadian roots, as IdrA trades off some Marines here, as whenever you went Blue Flame Hellion, you would delay your upgrades, so there's no combat shields on these Marines, and you can actually trade really well against no combat shield Marines. But this is Bomber, it's not a foreigner Terran, and he's going to have another production cycle come out and save his tanks. But this was Huck at the peak of his powers. It was crazy because he had won a huge LAN around this time of Orlando and would sort of back-to-back the MLGs, which would never be seen again from a foreigner. Just pretty much unheard of to be able to back-to-back major S-class lands after all the Koreans had come over. But IdrA has taken his 4th in the top right, and everything that IdrA's done this game has been fastidious and correct as far as the macro goes and the decisions he's made. We talked about the scout getting the gas timing. Notice he was running Lings around mid-map to check for the Terran's move out. Now he's darting in and harassing after picking off Marines. He can pick up a gas, which is going to limit the medevac tank and Thor count. And this is the sort of TVZ that we grew up watching. And I feel like such a boomer saying that, but back when I started watching StarCraft back in high school, this was one of these games that was exactly what I was after. It's a top tier macro player versus another top tier macro player. It's Terran versus Zerg. One of them's Korean and one of them's a foreigner. And these guys are just going at it back and forth. And this isn't one of those games where one player makes a silly error and just gets bowled over and dies. This is what it looks like when both players are playing intelligently and doing the right thing. They're trading blows. IdrA's running in and picking off the gas, but the Marines are right there to defend. We see triple turret up in the main. Bomber, of course, has been trying to fastidiously defend, but after IdrA got those mutas out and picked off those initial Marines, it was very difficult to defend, and here we see IdrA picking off an armory, which is huge because a huge part of the meta in Terran vs Zerg ever since the game came out and even up till today is where does the Terran's 2-2 upgrades stack up against the Zergs. And moving into Heart of the Swarm, as a Thor comes out, really what we saw was Zerg and Terran would sort of get 2-2 around the same time, but then Zerg would have a really hard time safely teching up into Hive and getting 3-3 because Terran could always keep the pressure on, and it's much easier for Terran to go into 3-3 because all you need is the armory as opposed to having to get all the way up into Hive, which is Zerg's tier 3, as IdrA screams in here with Mutiling Bane and just crushes this army mid-map. So whenever IdrA killed the first few initial Marines, he knew as a Brood War macro Terran, as that matchup is all about mutas in the early game and muta harass. It was always sort of fun to, in retrospect, see how IdrA would use mutas in the early part of StarCraft 2. You could tell he has Brood War roots just in the way that he would harass with them in low number, low econ situations. Whereas if you look into like 2012, 2013, as the game got older and older, you saw way less of that. This is sort of like a two hatch muta style build that you would see in Brood War, in the sense that IdrA tried to get two base drone saturation as fast as possible, get his Spire done, save larva, bank gas, get like 10 mutas out, and then do damage to the Terran, but most importantly keep them on their side of the map, which is the Brood War meta. If you look at Brood War ZvT, almost all games are like this, where the Zerg is going to open for muta, and then they're going to use the muta to keep the Terran contained and use that to get their third base up. In this matchup, the muta are used for a longer period in the game, and you make more of them, because remember, you can have unlimited units on control groups in StarCraft 2. As IdrA swings in here and denies this fourth, this is brilliant because notice that IdrA had an Overlord dropping creep on that base. You always want to do this as Zerg. This is a trick that is good all the way up into the current day. And again, when IdrA runs up with Lings there for that second little wave, it's like, wow, he has a lot of stuff over there. As we can see, IdrA's harassing in the main, as the original recording of this video was not one that I was able to observe. So the observer missing a little bit of muta harass, but we can deduce on the minimap that it's being deflected. But essentially what happened there is when IdrA ran in with the Lings at the fourth, the Terran player had to obviously move his Marine Thor over there, and IdrA darted into the main and killed both the E-bays. Notice that those E-bays that were on the left side were killed, and double eBay in the production tab to confirm that I am observant, as well as an armory. So it was just so important to get 3-3 first in this matchup, and in Heart of the Swarm, Zerg really had a hard time competing with that as IdrA swings in here, and whenever you see this heavily oversaturated third base, it is such a good feeling to just wipe that mineral line with mutas, because that's more than just picking off a gas geyser or killing a couple mules. You're wiping a whole mineral line. It's wow, IdrA gets the third. And it's funny to rewatch this game because this was probably like one of the first 20 out of like the first 20 games of StarCraft I ever saw. This was one of them. And IdrA just decimating a Bomber here with his perfect macro play. I love how as soon as the mutas came out, IdrA was in the driver's seat. In a time and a matchup in a metagame where that was not the case, whenever we watch Zerg versus Terran now, it's very easy for Zerg to stay in the driver's seat. All the maps are cookie cutter. See these weird high grounds in the middle of Shakura's plateau here where Terran can drop tanks up there insanely annoyingly? You don't see high grounds like that on maps anymore. All the maps now are boring and cookie cutter. If there is a weird map, the pro gamers insta-veto it, don't bother learning it, and bitch about it as IdrA screams in here with Mutiling Bling, but Bomber was going to run off of the backside of Creep and kill all the banelings off as he had a ton of tanks there. Way more tanks than an NA Terran would usually have, and IdrA has to buy time for the Banes, so he runs in, sacks the Lings, but does not want to trade Mutas into Stim Marines. But this is one of those things where you just have to go. If he runs all the way up to your skill Banes, you just die. And whenever you fastidiously and intelligently macro mutas well the entire game, you get to this big flock of mutas where you can actually do some scrappy fighting as long as you're not fighting a bunch of Stim Marines with upgrade advantage. Think about it, IdrA probably had like 30 mutas there to 20-something Marines, and there wasn't a ton of medevacs, and thank God there wasn't a Thor, because that's really what counters muta at this time is Thor, because it does splash and bonus damage to light. So IdrA put himself in a position with his incredible macro to be able to hold that push even whenever he took not really a bad engagement, but an engagement where all of his banelings died due to good tank harassment and placement. And again, it's one of those things where both players are macroing really well. The Korean Terran Bomber has gone for double factory tank, which I think was just so hard to deal with at this time. Remember, there's no mines at this time. IdrA working his way up to Greater Spire and +3. And I can't really harp on enough how important it is that IdrA ran in and killed those eBays. He killed the armory and then went back for seconds and killed the eBay. And in this time and in this meta, from the beginning of Wings of Liberty to, say, the beginning of 2012, Zergs weren't really as focused on, like, getting the double upgrades out. They would oftentimes delay getting the double upgrades for things like a faster Spire or getting a faster Bane Nest. Again, the Queen's not as good in this era. Zerg isn't as sturdy. If you look at the game now, Zerg is going to be massing Queens in the early game every single game. The Queen is so good because Zergs have gotten so good at spreading creep, and creep is such a powerful thing that you're always going to want more Queens for more creep. Guess what? If the Queen is good at defending everything and you're always incentivized to mass them, you're going to be put in a position where anytime the Terran does like their first little push out, as you see the eBays brutally killed here again, as it was pretty hard to win as Zerg in this meta against top tier Korean players. And during GSL in this mid-2011 period, it was a meme where it was called Bomber ZvT because it was just a ton of Terran players, Zerg, Protoss, having some trouble during this time. And really Zerg would sort of struggle into early 2012, not necessarily as bad as they had in 2010 and early 2011. This is what's so great about late 2011 is, like, not only are you having tournaments all the time, but the game's pretty balanced and the metagame is pretty even. And the ZVTs look like this, where Zerg has a ton of chances to die. If you're Terran, you can really put the... Oh, as you're seeing Festers out here, get a fungal down. But if you're Terran, you can really put the pressure on Zerg. There's a lot of chances for you to move out and almost get sort of lucky if the Zerg makes a mistake and just walk over them. As IdrA can't really engage into this Thor. He wants to get money fungals out, and he's in a huge power trough as he's trying to tech into Broodlord. And as Terran starts to get their big upgrades and their 3-3, and Ghosts were insanely imbalanced at this time. I know the Ghost was just nerfed in Legacy, but we were in a period here where the Ghost countered everything. As we see, a bunch of Marines are going to try to stem, and IdrA was really trying to bait Bomber into running in and getting a bunch of huge fungals off. This is always an awkward spot, as when you're Terran, you have like a distinct mid-game army that just shreds Mutiling Bling and really trades well, but you're in this position where once they get Broodlord and Fester, your tanks suck because they friendly fire the Broodlings. Your Marines aren't that good because they can be killed by the Infestors. Remember, Infestors did bonus damage to Armored, and the fungal was a snare and it was an instant cast. And really, everyone complained about the Infestor starting in 2012, but it was how safe it was to play Zerg that made the Infestor good. Because this is the same Infestor, and sure, it's strong, but here, this is what engagements with the Infestor looked like. Holy shit, as IdrA just gets fucking macerated here mid-map. And as we see, plummets in supply, falling way, way behind, as he's been ahead the entire time, and really just had an engagement where he tried to attack with Broodlords, and suddenly Bomber is in the driver's seat, surging forward across the map and knocking on the front door of IdrA as IdrA tries to make more Infestors, as he's really going to need to rely on fungal growth to do the lion's share of the damage here. But again, Bomber at an upgrade disadvantage, so IdrA's not dead yet, and IdrA considering a counterattack. But this is one thing about practicing against North American players and then having to play like top tier god level Korean players, is like it's really hard to get a counterattack off. Bomber always has more stuff than it seems like you should, or you're used to playing against when you play against Terrans. And early, before the Broodlord Infestor era really kicked into swing in 2012 after the Queen and Overlord patch, Zerg players were just not that good at controlling Infestors. They would run up, they would throw spells, and they would often forget about the Infestors or lose them. Or they didn't have them hotkeyed properly and they would run in with the rest of their army or die. And it wasn't the Infestor being so good that ended up making it imbalanced. It was the fact that Zerg became so much more sturdy with the Queen and Overlord buff when they made the Overlord more fast and made Zerg able to actually scout very efficiently and reliably, in addition to being able to hold all the aggressive options early with the Queen, being able to mass the Queen. That's what brought in the Broodlord Infestor era. That's what made Zerg so strong, because the Infestor was even stronger in this era and a little bit before than it was at the peak of like the Broodlord Infestor time, which I would say is like the other time in StarCraft 2 history where people complained about the Zerg race the hardest. Is we have a lot of complaining about Zerg in the current meta, and you never really see games like what we're watching right now in the current meta, do you? There's a lot of games where even though you start with 14 workers, 12 workers, whatever it is, you start with double workers, and you're in a position where it's very hard to, you're pretty much never going to be able to one base cheese. All of those builds are pretty much obsolete. You've taken away the early game TVZ back and forth of CC first. You've killed that by buffing the Reaper out of control and just making it too good not to make. And we've seen constant back and forth and a lot of decisions having to be made, and plenty of times within the game where the Zerg was at legitimate risk of getting run over and dying. This is part of what made this the most interesting matchup in the most interesting esport, as IdrA runs in again and throws a few infested Terran down. That was usually to sponge tank shots. The infested Terrans, by the way, scaled with upgrades at this time. I know a lot of people watching this video are like, infested Terrans? Like, what the hell is that? It's basically like a Zerg Marine that lasts 8 seconds, and you could cast them while burrowed. And we can see here that even though IdrA's been ahead all game, he's ravaged Bomber's economy, cleared multiple mineral lines, teched all the way up into tier 3, out-upgraded his opponent. It's still a razor's edge type thing where he's dumping spells all over the Terran army and still losing quite a few infestors. Whereas a year later, remember this one, November of 2011, if you look at like November of 2012 when Zergs had months and months to spam Broodlord Infestor, is you see a tank dropped on the high ground. This is what I was talking about earlier. Every single map in StarCraft 2 for the last 5 years, with maybe like a couple exceptions like Golden Wall, has just been laughably cookie cutter. The most boring, banal maps imaginable. Guess what maps that Zerg players love? The boring cookie cutter ones where they can do their standard build and don't have to account for any weird map feature like a high ground or like a weak base in a certain spot. And you know, the Protoss and Terran pro gamers only have themselves to blame to some extent, because what happened for years and years and years in this game, anytime there was a weird map or a rush map or a map that made you think, oh, a new map pool, that one's weird, insta veto, and then just complain about it. You know, God forbid if you actually made it to the finals of a tournament and it was a best of 7 and you had to play that map for the 7th game. Maru versus Life in 2015, in an IEM, it might have been like Taipei. That series comes to mind, where there was like this weird 4-player map where you could spawn in close that, like, again, all the pro gamers insta-vetoed. These are guys whose entire existence and living and being is to learn these maps and to figure out the best strats, and a lot of them just straight up didn't even try. Just insta-veto it, bitched about it. Make all the maps in the pool Zerg maps. This is Terran and Protoss players saying this shit, not just Zerg players. That's what you mean whenever you complain about a map being funky or unique, as we see IdrA really dominating this game. And again, the Terran player getting every little use and iota of value he can out of those high grounds, and he really didn't do that in the mid game very much, as we saw IdrA just use mutas to incredible effect and control the map the whole time. But this is just constant back and forth action, and when you contrast it to the current meta and the current watching experience of Legacy of the Void, even though like the games were lower level at this time, you know, people always say, if you took a legacy player now and dropped them back then, the legacy player would do so well. Well, that's true, but it's because in games like this, people are always improving and learning more. I'm talking about like the viewing experience of the game, what it was like to watch this game. How much action was there? How much intrigue was there? How much were the players fighting back and forth and showing their ability? Thinking about not getting supply blocked, flooding drones at the times when you could, teching into Broodlord Infestors, you could barely get it out there as Bomber GGs. But just to wrap up my thoughts here, we're sitting in a meta where people are complaining about Zerg constantly. You hear phrases like Zerg Cabal, like, oh, all these major tournaments are won by Zerg players. Well, the big problem is the maps. And StarCraft Brood War, they haven't patched the game in like 20 years. Guess what? They balance the game through maps. If a certain race is doing too well, they'll make maps that favor a certain race. And in StarCraft 2, this is a concept that hasn't really been employed at all, because what you have is a bunch of pro gamers who just want to bitch and moan anytime the maps are a little bit different. And for every day that has gone by since StarCraft 2 came out, Zerg players have gotten a little bit better at defending and understanding the different things that the races can do to them at different points in the game. And the maps have gotten more defender friendly. The patches have gotten more defender friendly in terms of, well, if Zerg just wants to make a bunch of drones and a bunch of queens, then that's totally fine. But it puts you in a position in an esport where you've taken all the early game interest out of most of the Terran matchups, because you've buffed the Reaper a billion times, and you've taken the intrigue out of the game to an extent where it's lost a lot of its honestly, I hate to say this, but like the game right now as it stands is really not that fun to watch. Like, Blizzard has robbed StarCraft 2 out of most of its watchability, and everyone, especially who is on Reddit and doesn't actually play the fucking game and just wants to like parrot things that they've read on the internet from other people who don't play the fucking game. Guess what? It's not just because that Zerg has all the best units or that Zerg's like this unbeatable god race. A lot of it has to do with the maps. And if you have a map pool full of boring horseshit cookie cutter maps, then you're gonna get a boring horseshit cookie cutter metagame. And Blizzard has really, really screwed the pooch in terms of the last couple years of StarCraft 2 and how they've been balancing it. A lot of times the decisions they make are so bad where it's almost like they're doing the dumb thing on purpose. Like when you look at something like the shield battery, whenever it first came out, and shield battery overcharge, and you would see like 30 supply of Terran units or 30 Zerglings being held off by like 3 or 4 Protoss units, and everything would be focus firing one unit that would be like it would be shield battery boosted to infinite health. Like, even a novice StarCraft player can look at that and be like, oh, that's fucking stupid. Like, he's focusing this one immortal. There's one immortal and 2 stalkers versus like 25 Marines and 2 medevacs, and all the Marines are shooting the Immortal, and it's just being spam shielded up. Like, everyone knew that was a joke. Like, and this is, you know, I could go on and on with all the dumb patches that Blizzard has done, but it is just so bizarre to play the game and see the direction it's going and the sort of decisions that Blizzard comes out with. And honestly, I think the Ravager coming out was a big mistake in terms of a lot of what you had in these matchups is Zerg being very flimsy early on and being the race that really had to scout well and try to cut corners. And what you've gotten now is, since Zergs have gotten better every single day at defending and learning how to macro, it has sort of snowballed with the fact that Zerg has gotten a lot of consistent tools to defend, and now you have a game that's largely been figured out by players who have essentially sat there like the Korean player Rogue and been like, okay, well, I know as long as I don't die to this, I'll probably beat this guy, because it's just so easy for me to get up to 66 drones. Like, think about how hard it was for IdrA even to take his third. Like, he had to get 10 mutas out, do incredible harassment, and honestly, like, get lucky with a Bomber's combat shield timing. Not really lucky, but like Bomber went for blue flame, thus like his combat shield was later, and he got to hit before combat shield was later. That had to happen just for IdrA to get his third base going. And then he was ahead, did great harass, and then did one big attack and almost lost. How often do you feel like you watch StarCraft 2 now and the Zerg player is at like a tenuous risk of dying? How often are you watching ZvT now and it's like, okay, the Terran's going to contest the Zerg third here, and it actually be like a big thing that's interesting. What you see a lot now is like the Terran player sort of runs through the motions. Almost like, you know, okay, I'll make Hellions just because it's the thing to do. I know he's never going to die to them, because when the Hellions get there, there's going to be 4 extra defensive queens. Whereas if we think about what happened early in this game, whenever the Terran player opens for Hellions, there's 1 fucking queen there. Look at this. He gets there with the Hellions, and the only reason that he can't run in and do devastating damage is because of the spine. There's only 1 extra queen, there's no transfuse energy, it's old blue flame against a handful of lings. If you skip the spine here, you're incredibly vulnerable. And remember, the worrisome thing about Hellions is they can run in and take 1 shot, and if you don't have anything to stop it, or a wall in, or queens blocking, they can just run into your main. And it wasn't as easy to replenish workers in this Wings of Liberty era than it is in Legacy. And people will often say like, oh, Wings of Liberty, the ramp up is slower. Well, guess what? Like, that's a good thing to some extent, because the players actually have fucking decisions to make. You look at a Legacy game, it's like they're always going to expand once. The third base is almost a gimme in Legacy games. And when you look at a Zerg unit like the Ravager, it really makes it hard for Protoss to put pressure on. And Force Field, it's such a weird, difficult thing to balance, but you put stuff like Force Field in the game, you put stuff like Liberators in the game, and you hand tie your map makers. You tie their hands because it's like, oh, you can't have this much space behind a mineral line or Liberators can just ruin the game. You can't have small chokes because sentries will just ruin the game. Part of why they released the Ravager was like, okay, well, this will allow us to be a little bit more creative in our map design. But really what that's come down to is it's made Zerg just so incredibly versatile defensively. I think that the Ravager is a unit that doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to like how the meta changed. Because I played all 3 races for a really long time, and have gotten like high MMR with all 3 races. And in Wings of Liberty and in Heart of the Swarm, playing Protoss against Zerg and playing Terran against Zerg were way more fun and rewarding for the Terran and Protoss side, and there was a way bigger feeling of being able to catch the Zerg off guard and being able to come back in a game where you were behind. Now, when you play against a good Zerg, it really does feel like you can't even do anything until they get to third base and there's creep halfway across the map. In this meta and in this time in Wings of Liberty, it wasn't like that. As we see, This is a beautiful little interaction that's occurring right here, where combat shields has been delayed, as well as the second eBay, because the Terran player had to tech up to blue flame, and that's a big economy choice whenever you don't start off with a ton of workers and you get to hyper drive into 40 workers automatically, you just to get everything every game. There was more of a decision in this meta, like what is the Terran player's first big push, and because he elected to go for blue flame, his combat shield is delayed, which is the only reason the mutas can come in. Like, this small number mutaverse marine fight, having no shield is a huge deal, and having no medevac is a huge deal. Those are both direct results of the early game build order timing. And we see an interesting way that those two things interact when IdrA flies across the map and is able to target those marines. Now after he does that, that allows him to get subsequent muta harass off because there's less of a marine force to defend. You don't ever see transitioning stuff like this in the current metagame in Legacy of the Void. The way it works is, Terran does their first little push, and even with Ignite Afterburners, a lot of what it comes down to is the push either works or it doesn't. They retain very few of the units unless they're just picking them up and running away, which is a very uninteresting thing to watch because the Zerg literally can't catch Ignite Afterburners. So whenever you're watching it as a viewer, you know, like, okay, he has medevacs, so now it becomes, as the Zerg player, you're never going to be able to like clear the army and kill all the medevacs like in this meta, which was a big deal. The ability for the Zerg to run in, pick off medevacs, or pick off a lazy drop full of marines that you scouted with an overlord. You know, Blizzard thought they were being cool and promoting like an aggressive play when they gave medevacs boost, but really all it did was it made the matchup where Zerg couldn't chase down drops, they couldn't kill medevacs that were sort of straggling from a lost fight, and you take away some of the excitement whenever you're watching it and you know, like, okay, the Terran's moving out with medevacs, I know that like he's not going to move the medevacs. Or like if the Zerg doesn't have air, he's just going to be able to pick everything up and boost away with impunity. And whenever you take an interesting game like this with an established meta, as we see, really this is like what the game swung on here, is IdrA kills the armory, preventing +2 armor from being started, and this sort of cascades and allows him to pick up the upgrade subsequently, and he's just doing so much damage here. And notice that Bomber is pushed out on his side of the map, but because Bomber is being forced to multitask so heavily and IdrA's creep spread is so far up, Bomber's not able to effectively counterattack. But when I look at this game, it's like everything that's right about StarCraft 2, like the Terran's early game build order decision affects like what units he has in the mid-game phase of the game. Like the Zerg mutas actually have enough opportunity and time and tempo to run in and harass, and the harassment cascades into the next harassment in the sense that it matters. It slows down the fourth, the creeps, you know, it's just like, this is like everything that's right with StarCraft 2. Even like some dim animal on Reddit who doesn't play the game might be like, wow, this is so low level compared to what we see now. It's just like totally dim. Whenever you see comments like that, you just know the person knows like fucking nothing about the game, because they don't understand like the little intricacies and decision making and thought processes and like timing differences. They don't understand like how easy it was to die to that blue flame Hellion timing that IdrA held off. You know, they don't understand that whenever Zerg surprised you with a bunch of mutas and you delayed your combat shield and you didn't have medevacs yet and you didn't have Thors yet, that Zerg could really get around to get damage done. The Legacy of the Void game is so drab and so played out and so cookie cutter. And again, that's a great example. IdrA, because of his good Overlord sped, saw that medevac, flew up, and was able to pick it off, which is a big deal to lose a medevac full of units, and it allowed him to take the supply edge. That's an example of good scouting paying off and rewarding you. Well, in the current meta, the Terran player just medevac boosts away. Like, there's no risk. That's part of why whenever the first big Heart of the Swarm tournament in the States happened, MLG Dallas, and whenever Terrans were just effortlessly rolling over Zergs and winning everything with the boost, people in the crowd were going, boost, and it sounded like booing, because the average StarCraft player might not have been able to verbalize it, but the ability to always get away scot-free is just a very fucking boring thing to watch. So it's a great example of how you can give people more. You can give them something that seems like, oh, it's an aggressive option, it'll encourage them to drop more, and it's like, well, it's a lot like the Reaper. If you make the Reaper so good where you always have to make it, there's no reason not to make the Reaper, because if you make it, you'll never ever die to cheese because you just buffed it so much. Guess what? You might start the game with 12 workers, but the early game is more boring than it was in Wings of Liberty because the Terran doesn't have as many choices. Like, Blizzard just doesn't seem to understand that, and like they haven't understood that for years. It's like part of what makes this game interesting is like the choices and the trades that players make in the early game. We saw like a whole little combat triangle occur in this meta in Wings of Liberty, where the Terran could either go like 2 racks expand or CC first, and the Zerg could go like speedling expand, hatchery first, or 3 hatch before pool. And it was this interesting little dichotomy of, do I think I'm playing a greedy opponent? Can I get away with 3 hatch before pool? Should I be super safe and open speedling if I think he's going to be aggressive? You've killed that with the Reaper. You've made something that allows players to show what they think of each other as well as their strategic understanding and strategic diversity. You've taken that all away for the Reaper, lol. The most boring and contrived thing in the whole fucking game. The Reaper shooting the 4 lings at the beginning of the game. You took away what is essentially the equivalent of like openings in chess. Like, what is the finite little opening build order my opponent's going to do? And in these tournament games, these best of 3s, these best of 5s, these best of 7s, that stuff really matters and really shows what the players think about each other. Great example, that old BWC Venomous Classic game where Vibe plays IdrA, and IdrA wins the macro game where they both go hatch first in a best of 3, and then Vibe goes 10 pool twice because he thinks IdrA wants to go hatch first, and Vibe wins both times because he picked the correct early game build. You don't even have the chance for that in Legacy of the Void, and that's why the game is so boring. Because what happens in Legacy of the Void ZvT? Well, nothing in the first 5 minutes because the Reaper's so good. It completely disallows the Zerg to do any sort of like Roach or Ling Bane nonsense, because guess what? The scouting, especially when you couple it with the Hellion, is just perfect. Can't stop it. Literally can't stop it. And then what happens? Well, the Zerg's defensive options with the Queen are all way better, so Zerg is way less flimsy and is just way easier to defend with. Okay, so the mid game's more boring too. And what about the late game? Well, the Ultra's been a fucking joke since 2016 when we took away that 7 armor. So then you encourage Zerg to go Broodlord, which is the most boring, unfun to watch unit in the game. And it's not fun to play with or against. And what do you have to do with the Broodlord? Because it's so immobile and slow, you have to make infestors to lock stuff down. You have to make mass static defense to avoid counterattacks. So what has Blizzard done? They've ruined the whole ZvT meta. And nothing they did in the patch is really going to change the ZvT meta at all, except Terran can't just spam late game ghosts against a shitty, boring Zerg tier 3. Look, like, if Zerg gets to tier 3, they should be able to make Ultras run in and get shit done. Like, it's an abhorrent disgrace that the boring, slow, immobile Broodlord has been really Zerg's only tier 3 option since Wings of Liberty. Because if you take out the first couple months that Wings was out and the Ultra Splash bug existed, and you take out that period in HOTS when they started with 2 extra armor, the Ultra's been a fucking joke for the entirety of StarCraft 2. The joke about the Ultra in Wings of Liberty was it was the unit you made if you got the Hive Tech and wanted to lose. The only way people could ever use Ultras in StarCraft 2, whereas if you made a bunch of Broodlords, the Terran panicked and put down 5 starports and they were mass-producing Vikings, you traded the whole army out, had a huge bank, and were able to swap into Ultras and maintain your infestors. That's the only use they had, was for a freaking tech switch. That's a joke. We're talking about like the bread and butter like tier 3 Zerg unit. You want to talk about like why this game's lost viewership since fucking Wings of Liberty through one stale meta after another. Pick a time where Zerg has had to rely on free units to win a matchup. Think about like all the meta games where the Zerg using free units like the Broodlord and Swarmhost. Those have been the worst fucking metas in all of StarCraft 2 history. The Zerg vs Protoss meta and HOTS, with the insane amount of minerals at each base, and Zerg basically not being able to compete with a lot of the ground and pound force field army. Oh, well, we'll just rush Swarm Host. Snoop made that style popular, and I asked him personally about this at a LAN, and he said he hated playing that style. Like, the game should be fun to watch. It should encourage fun styles to play. You shouldn't be in a position where, as Zerg, if it's like, what's the best way to win if I'm a smart macro player and want to play correctly? You do this boring, pedantic thing and like take it in the ass for 40 minutes, and then turtle and make a billion spores and spines, and you can never attack, and the other player can never attack into you, so they're just gonna like run around with drops. Like, no. If Zerg gets to tier 3, what they should want and be encouraged to do based on the metagame and patch is to fucking make ultras and be able to go in and aggressively and decisively try to end the game. Not make Broodlords, where even in the small-ass map, Shakuras Plateau, you can see how hard it is to really get that favorable engagement, because, oh, I gotta move all the way over there, and it's probably gonna be off creep, and look, there's a high ground here, there's reeds here, and like, you might say, oh, what a bad attack by IdrA, what a newbie. Yeah, he had only made every correct decision the entire time, and should have been just so far ahead where he couldn't lose. And what does he do? He takes this huge lead and tries to attack, and even though he had Broodlord Infestor with a ton of mutas with upgrades, he lost. Well, why did he lose? Well, because he got a little bit impatient and tried to attack off a creep. And a little bit impatient should be okay if you've made every correct decision and gotten every little advantage from the fucking jump. Like, IdrA didn't lose any workers to the drone harass. He didn't lose anything to the Blue Flame Hellions. He was ahead with the mutas attacking, and even then you saw how hard it was to get aggressive with Broodlords. That's what made the Broodlord Infestor meta so terrible and so boring. You couldn't do anything with the Broodlords. You had to make a million spines. You had to make a million infestors. You couldn't attack. It would just go like that if you tried to attack with that slow joke army. So what happened? Zerg got a little more sturdy. That allowed Zerg players to be able to make mass infester. And even worse, they realized, like, I can go Spire into Quick Hive and just skip the mutas, because the Protoss were opening air, and the, you would just go double upgrade Lings with a bunch of infestors instead of mutas. And then you can't even see the mutas harass, which Mutaling Bane versus Terran is one of the most exciting, fun things to watch. And when you think about ZvT now, like, how much like true Mutaling Bane versus Bio is there? Not a lot. There's a lot of like ostentatious, like boring, like pedantic pushes at a 4th base into neither player being able to do anything. And people love to bitch and moan about Zerg, and Zerg players really have figured out like this intelligent defensive macro approach, to the point with all the sturdy queens and these giant ass macro maps that, yeah, they can consistently win the tournaments. But I want Zerg players to be able to be aggressive and go ultra and go Mutaling Baneling and win that way, and not have to go Broodlord Infestor and make Vipers and a billion Spore Spine. Are there Zerg players that would still play like that if the meta was more favoring of like the Ultra and Mutaling Bane? Sure. But there would also be a plethora of players who would be able to actually employ an aggressive approach and sit in the driver's seat, whereas it stands now, with gimmicks like the battery, even post-nerf, you're putting Zerg in a position where it's like, well, the best style for me to win is to actually just sit here with my thumb up my ass the entire game and not do anything. And this is a meta that Blizzard has promoted, and has promoted with their terrible map pool. So, hope you enjoyed this throwback ZvT, and I think it's a nice little representation of why the game that we love so much, StarCraft 2, is not what it used to be. Easy.